Hello and welcome to the Django DRF project, eCommerce. This tutorial is part of a series of tutorials which you can watch for free. The link to the YouTube course playlist is in the video description. This course is also available on Udemy, where you can watch the course ad-free, download the tutorial source code, and access all updated tutorials and playlist. The link to the course, which will always provide the best price, can be found in the video description. To ensure that other developers can utilize this API, we are going to be developing the documentation as we develop this application throughout this course. Building our API documentation is really a straightforward process once we have set up the tools which will automate the process. Here in this course, we are going to be utilizing DRF Spectacular and SwaggerUI. So there are two components here. And essentially what's happening here, we have DRF Spectacular, which is going to essentially collect all the information about our API and put that into a format which can then be utilized by a front-end package, in this case SwaggerUI, and present that information to the other developers or anyone who wants to interact with our API. This is the package on PyPy, so DRF Spectacular, that's what you're looking for. If you're interested in having a look at the documentation, then head over to PyPy or just type in DRF Spectacular into Google. Right, let's go ahead and install. So back in our application, let's go ahead and just close that, make sure that we're in the right directory. Yep, right, so let's go ahead and pip install DRF Spectacular. There we go. Right, okay. My fault. There we go. So pip install DRF Spectacular, and there we go. Right, so that's nicely installed. Now we need to add that. So I'm just going to actually add that first to the new document here. So I was just updating it. The commands for this section of the course, so 1.0.1 commands. You'll find that with where you'll find the source code for this course, or you'll find it locally in the tutorial. You'll be able to download the resource. So let me just update this. So we're going to install DRF Spectacular. We've done that. Let's head over now to DRF and then settings. Just need to register this. So the base. Now this is a type of package which maybe you only have running locally, potentially, but maybe not. So I'm just trying to emphasize the point that maybe some of these packages that we still install will just be for development only. So we may want to add them to the individual modules here, local or production. But let's just continue as we are, because really it was just a drop in an idea in regards to modularizing settings. But we'll focus on that later when it's really required, when we're actually deploying the application. So this is an external package. Let's add this in. So DRF Spectacular. So there are a few different settings that we can apply here. What we need to do is we need to register Spectacular as the auto schema with DRF. So let's go into our settings at the bottom. Now we had already created our REST framework in preparation here for our settings. So let's set the default schema class. And we just need to set that to DRF Spectacular. So DRF Spectacular dot open API dot auto schema. So what we can do at this point is also add some additional metadata. So that's going to be in the spectacular settings. So we'll add some additional metadata. So for example, and this will make more sense, you'll be able to see this where this is going to be placed, but let's just add a title to begin with. Let's call this project Django DRF eCommerce. So we'll just add a title for now, and we'll add a comma there to bring that down. Okay, so we'll just add the title for now, and yeah, that'll do for now. We can add some more things later. So that's how to set some of the settings. Now, of course, you can check the documentation and you'll be able to see all the different settings that you can apply here, but let's just get this working first. So with that done, now let's think about how we're actually going to be able to create our schema, because what we're going to do is we're going to create a schema. So we're going to use, like we said in the introduction, we're going to use DRF Spectacular to actually construct a schema, and that's going to be a file. It's going to generate a file, and that file is basically going to be a map of all the different interactions that are possible within our API, RESTful API. And then we can utilize that information to display it in a web interface. Right, so now everything is installed and we have a basic setup. Let's go ahead and actually build our schema file. Let's give this a go. So let me just bring that back in. Let's go ahead and just clear this. So to do this, what we need to do is, what's going on? Okay, right, so what we're going to need to do here is use manage.py, and then we're going to need to initiate spectacular. So spectacular, and then let's now save this to a file called schema dot. It's going to be a YAML file. Okay, so no module name DRF spectacular. So if you go back into the base, if you do receive this problem, you've simply just renamed it incorrectly, as like I've done here. So it's not DRF dash, it's going to be underscore. Apologies. So in the base settings here, I'm just going to change that to an underscore. So let's try that again. So manage.py spectacular, create a new file called schema.yaml. Okay, so this time we get an error here, default schema class, module not found, no module name DRF spectacular. So this time it looks like we now have an issue, maybe a typo down here in our settings. And it's the same problem, apologies. So it's not a dash there, it's going to be an underscore again. Apologies. Right, so that is changed there in line 101 in our base settings. So DRF underscore spectacular. So let's now give that a go again. And this time it does look like it may have been successful. So you can see here on the left-hand side, the schema file now appears. There are no warnings. There may be 4 errors here. That's not a problem at all. And we'll go through why that is shortly. We might need to change some of the settings here. So for particular views, it may have problems actually finding or generating the information that's required. It's not a problem for now. We'll deal with that shortly. But just the fact that looks like we have generated a schema here. So we go into the schema, what we've got here. So you can see the title appears. That was the metadata that we added in the settings. And you can see that we could probably add some more version and so on. You can see a path. So this is the path. Now remember how to get to the category to display all the categories. It was API/category. So you can start to see it's started to generate information about the endpoints that we've defined within our application, within our API. And you can see that it then adds some additional information about how you would then interact. So the details about interacting with that path. Now, this is a really simple interface here, simple get interface, but some interfaces may have, for example, other attributes that can be passed in. So it looks like it's working okay. It looks like we've got some sort of response. It's been tested and some additional information here. Now, let's just test this out first. Let's just go ahead and put this into the UI, get the UI working, and then we'll resolve any of the errors. So I'm trying to keep this in order. Now, I don't want to forget to add this to my requirements. I may have not done that yet. So let's just add DRF Spectacular to the requirements. Let's just keep that up to date. So pip freeze before we do anything else, requirements. So that keeps everything up to date. So we've got DRF Spectacular now in the requirements. We know that the requirements is now updated. Right, so let's just close down because there's loads of stuff open here. Can be a little bit confusing. Right, so now we're going to sort out the front end, if you like. So we're going to activate the packages, which will allow us to show this documentation in a front end. So let's go into our DRF eCommerce, and we need to go to the URLs. So let's find the URLs. Okay, so we're going to need to bring in all the tools that are going to be needed. So from DRF, now let's remember the underscore, spectacular dot views. Let's go ahead and import spectacular API view, and we're going to need the spectacular Swagger view. So we're using SwaggerUI to render our schema file. We'll just bring this over a bit. We're going to stay in the URLs. Okay, so that's the two packages that we're going to need. So now we just need to set up a path for our schema so we can actually view it. So let's make sure that we've added this in correctly, comma. Yep. Okay, so we need a comma right here. There we go. So let's add a new path. So let's go for API schema. You can use whatever path you like, but let's go for API, or it could just be schema. Yeah, let's go for API schema to begin with. So that's where we're going to find our schema. So we need to bring in the spectacular API view, dot as view. So these are views that are built in, which is going to allow us to interact with our schema. So let's go ahead and say name equals schema. Okay, so now we've set that up. What we can do now is actually use an API. So what this link is, we navigate to it, but essentially that is rendering, if you like, or making available our schema. So what we do now is we add a front end which can access that path and then render that information onto a front end, if you like. So what we can do now is add a new path here. Now we call this API slash schema slash, for example, docs. So this is where we're actually going to access and view the schema. So this is the Swagger view dot as view. Okay, and then we need to specify the URL. So URL name, that's the name that we've just generated here. That's going to be schema. So URL name equals, so we pass in the schema, and then it will then render the schema data. Right, and there we go. Let's give this a go. So mesh.py, let's run the server. Let's just remind ourselves. So API schema, and then we go to the docs. We'll look at both endpoints. Right, so back in the server, the local loopback address /API. That's obviously going to take us to the endpoint here that we've generated earlier. So let's now go into schema. Now, I'm not going to actually activate this because essentially this is the path to the schema file, if you like. So if I went to this endpoint here, this URL, it would simply just ask me to download the schema. So I don't need to look at that. So let's go to the last point, which is docs. So if I activate that, or if I navigate to that, you can now see I'm now displaying all the information that's been generated in the schema. So it looks like it's collected information about the schema and also information about the endpoints. And obviously we only have one at the moment, and that's the API category endpoint. So you can see how to interact with it. It's going to require a GET request. So it looks like we can only retrieve data from this endpoint, being that it only accepts a GET request. So we can use the drop down here. And what we can do is, there's a few different options here. We can try it out. So this gives us the interface to be able to actually test out the endpoint. So we can execute, and it gives us information about the actual command that was used to actually run that request or create that request, the request URL. And then it also then provides the output. So this is a response. In addition to that, there is some additional information here which can be useful much later on. Response headers, that can give us some additional information when we're trying to maybe troubleshoot. So that is a simple implementation of our documentation that we're going to be generating. It might not seem too much at the moment, but hopefully you're going to see the benefit of it as and when we start developing more endpoints. As a front-end developer, I can spin up this documentation and I can take a look And what it's going to show me eventually is the endpoint, and then it's going to give me information about what data I can kind of collect from that endpoint. So if I'm looking for something specific, if, for example, there is an endpoint here or a way to interface with the API that requires me to pass in different parameters, then this is going to give me those details. It's going to tell me what data is going to return, what type of data is being returned, all sorts of useful information as a front-end developer. So you might notice this authorize button here. So if I click on this authorize button, you can see that potentially some of these endpoints might require some sort of authorization. So eventually we may move into security and think about that. But for now, there's nothing much here to talk about. Right. So going back to the code, if you remember, when we generated our schema, there was a few different issues. So let's just replicate that again. So just running and rebuilding our schema here. And you can see that there was 0 warnings, but 4 errors. So unable to guess serializer. So utilizing a view set, as we've done here, it isn't able, by default at least, to work out what serializer we're using. And that's useful information, and that will add to the documentation. So let me just give you a resolution to this problem here. So let's go into our document, our project here. Let's go to the views. So product views, and let's go down to our view set. Now, some approaches we can use to create views will explicitly define, for example, the serializer, and DRF Spectacular is able to actually collect information from that. Now, because we're utilizing this approach where we're utilizing this list function here, it isn't able to work out which serializer we're using. So all we need to do is create or just declarate essentially the function here and provide some additional information. So it's able to utilize that when it builds the schema. So we're bringing the tools, DRF Spectacular, DRF Spectacular .utils. Let's go ahead and import the extend schema. You can check out the documentation if you need more information about it. There's a few different options here, but no doubt we're going to be utilizing a few of them as we move through this project. So at extend schema. So we're going to just essentially just specify responses equals, and then just define the serializer that we're using. So in this case, we're actually using the category serializer. So that is essentially telling DRF Spectacular what serializer we're using, and that's going to be able to utilize that information to generate more documentation. So let's roll out the schema again. So we're going to run the schema, and notice that this time it's run. There are no errors at all. So everything is working perfectly. So let's go over to the front end. First of all, let's just load the server, run the server, and just go ahead and refresh. And this time you can now see we have the schema option down here. And what we have is essentially we're given information about our serializer. Remember our serializer? It offers these, for example, fields. So we're given more information about our fields, and that will then give us more information about the data types. That can be really useful, particularly when we're trying to add data or send data to our API. It would be useful to know what data is required. So that's going to give us some additional information there. So all information is good information. So we just drop that down. And again, that's probably going to make more sense. Once we move into the front end and start to utilize this information, it may kind of resonate a little bit more as to why this information is important. But for now, we're all set up. And as we further develop, all we need to do essentially will be to keep building our schemas as and when we add more endpoints, and this documentation will nicely scale. We'll keep moving into this and solve any errors, fix any problems that might occur as we utilize different tools from the DRF toolkit. But for now, we're ready to move on. Before I forget, let's also remember that we will need to add schema.yaml to the git ignore file. So let's just add that in. so that we don't save that to our source control. So we'll just add that over there. So that should now be grayed out like that. So we're not going to add that to our source control.